Hello and welcome. Today, we are diving deep into one of the most misunderstood and honestly one of the most important periods in all of American history, Reconstruction. This is the story of what happened right after the Civil War ended, a wild, turbulent time when the country tried to figure out how to put itself back together again.
So, just picture it. It's 1865. The guns have fallen silent, but the country is an absolute wreck. And the real challenge wasn't just rebuilding cities. It was about rebuilding the very idea of a single nation. I mean, what do you do with the states that just tried to leave? What about the Confederate leaders? And the biggest question of all, what does freedom actually mean for 4 million people who were, just yesterday, enslaved? These aren't just details. These are the questions that would shape everything that came next.
All right, so here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll look at the early plans for peace coming from the presidents. Then, we'll get into radical Reconstruction, which is when Congress basically takes the wheel. After that, we'll explore what this rebuilt South actually looked like on the ground. And finally, we'll dig into why this whole incredible, messy experiment is often called an unfinished revolution. Okay, so right out of the gate, the job of putting the country back together falls to the presidents. First Abraham Lincoln, and then, after his assassination, Andrew Johnson. And let me tell you, they had very different ideas about how to get it done.
You can see the clash right here. Lincoln, he wanted to bring the South back into the fold quickly and without too much punishment. His 10% plan was super lenient. But Congress, they were not having it. They thought that was letting the South off way too easily. So they hit back with the Wade-Davis bill, which was much tougher. It demanded a full 50% of voters swear loyalty, and, critically, it called for real protections for the freedmen. This right here, this is the beginning of a huge power struggle. And then the unthinkable happens. Lincoln is killed, and his vice president, Andrew Johnson, is now in charge. Now, you gotta understand, Johnson was a Southerner, a Democrat put on the ticket to show unity, but his vision for Reconstruction was even softer than Lincoln's. He started pardoning former Confederate leaders left and right, and this just absolutely infuriated the Republicans in Congress. They felt like he was siding with the enemy. And this slide shows you exactly why they were so worried. Under Johnson's gentle guidance, the new Southern governments almost immediately passed these things called the Black Codes. And let's be clear, these were nasty laws designed to control Black people's lives. They couldn't own certain property, they couldn't travel freely, they were forced into year-long labor contracts. I mean, to people in the North, it looked an awful lot like the South was just trying to bring back slavery under a different name. It felt like the whole war had been for nothing. So, between the South's defiance and President Johnson's policies, that was it. The radical Republicans in Congress decided, okay, if the president won't do this right, we will. And this is where the story takes a dramatic turn, and Congress basically hijacks the whole process of Reconstruction.
One of their first big moves was the Freedmen's Bureau. Now, this was a huge deal. It was basically a massive federal aid agency, the first of its kind, really. It was set up to help millions of people, mostly former slaves, but also poor whites, get on their feet. They provided food, they helped set up thousands of schools, they negotiated labor contracts. It was constantly under attack and never had enough money, but it represented this powerful new idea that the federal government had a responsibility to its newest, most vulnerable citizens. And you can see on this timeline just how quickly things escalated. In 1867, Congress passes the Reconstruction Acts. This literally puts the South under military rule to make sure new laws are enforced and Black men can vote. The fight with President Johnson gets so bad that they actually impeach him. He survives being removed from office by a single vote, can you imagine? But the point was made. Congress was running the show now. But this wasn't just about passing laws. This was about changing the rulebook of the entire country. They passed 2 constitutional amendments that are still incredibly important today. The 14th Amendment wrote birthright citizenship into the Constitution and promised everyone equal protection of the laws. Then the 15th Amendment came along to make it illegal to deny someone the right to vote because of their race. These weren't temporary fixes. They were meant to be a permanent revolution. All right, so Congress is in charge, the Army is in the South, and the Constitution has been changed. So what did all this look like for people actually living through it? Well, the reality was a very messy, very complicated mix of incredible progress, real failures, and just brutal, violent resistance. For the first time ever, you had this completely new group of people running things in the South. You had scalawags, that was the insult for Southern whites who joined the Republican Party. You had carpetbaggers, another insult for Northerners who moved down south. But most importantly, you had hundreds of thousands of African-American men voting and holding office for the very first time, from local sheriffs all the way up to the U.S. Senate.
This was absolutely revolutionary. And this table does a great job of showing the two sides of the coin. On the one hand, these new governments did amazing things. They established voting rights for all men, gave more property rights to women, and, get this, created the first state-funded public school systems in the South. But on the other hand, yeah, there was a lot of corruption and inexperience, taxes went up, and the Republican Party itself was often split with infighting, which made them weak. And here's the other big problem. While politics were changing, the economy, not so much. The dream that every freedman would get 40 acres and a mule never happened. Instead, what you got was sharecropping. On the surface, it sounded like a step up, renting land and working for yourself. But in reality, it was a trap. The landowners, who were usually the former masters, would charge such high prices for supplies and take such a large cut of the crop that families ended up in debt, year after year after year. It was a new kind of prison. And shadowing all of this was a campaign of outright terrorism. And this wasn't just random anger. This was an organized insurgency led by groups like the Ku Klux Klan. They used whippings, lynchings, and assassinations to terrorize Black citizens and their white allies. Their goal was crystal clear: overthrow the Reconstruction governments by force and put white supremacy back in charge, no matter the cost. So you have these incredible gains, but they're being fiercely contested. And eventually, the rest of the country, well, its will to keep fighting this difficult, expensive, and bloody battle just started to run out. So what happened? Well, a couple of things. President Grant's government got bogged down in a bunch of corruption scandals, which kind of soured the public on the whole Republican project. And then a massive economic depression hit in 1873. Suddenly, people in the North were more worried about their own jobs and families than they were about protecting civil rights hundreds of miles away. The focus shifted, and the energy just fizzled out. The final nail in the coffin was the presidential election of 1876. It was a total mess, completely disputed, and it got settled in a classic, smoky backroom deal. They called it the Compromise of 1877. Here's the deal. The Democrats would let the Republican candidate become president, but in exchange, the Republicans had to pull the last of the federal troops out of the South. And that was it. That was the end. Those federal troops were the only thing protecting the Republican governments and Black voters. As soon as they left, those last governments collapsed. The so-called Redeemers, white Democrats, swept back into power across the entire South. And just like that, the nation's brief, radical experiment with a multiracial democracy was over. So Reconstruction ends in 1877, but the questions it tried to answer, they didn't go away. In fact, they're still with us. It left behind the 14th and 15th Amendments, these incredible tools that would fuel the civil rights movement a century later. But it also left a legacy of a promise broken. And when you think about it, the central debates of that era, who gets to be a full citizen? What does equality really mean? And what is the government's job in protecting our rights? Well, those are the very same questions we are still arguing about today.